Hello everyone, this is just a short video on Stephen Hawking, and I'll just briefly mention one thing that I found really impressive about him. Now for a tribute video, this is somewhat late and it will also be relatively short, and there are several reasons for that. Generally, I think that making a YouTube video about someone's death in an even somewhat acceptable manner requires a certain tact and skill that I don't necessarily have. And I certainly didn't want to jump on the obligatory media bandwagon where everyone kind of mentions him just to basically profit off a spike in search results that's not really fitting of the situation in my mind. Also, there isn't really that much to say. Human death is always tragic, and we have lost a really bright mind. His contributions to science were of course too complex and versatile to really explain them all, while the brief highlights are relatively quickly summarized and have been before. And I don't really just want to repeat what everyone else already said. Isaac Arthur has already made a video about him, which I can only recommend. And in some of his other videos he goes a little more in depth into the exact achievements of Stephen Hawking. And I just want to try and explain how absolutely fascinating his mind must have been. To be able to even understand and then furthermore contribute to modern physics, despite his disease, would seem pretty much impossible if he hadn't actually done it. And it's often mentioned how difficult his overall life must have been, or how complicated it would have been to communicate or write a book or speak with anyone through this device. But in fact it's even the thinking itself that must have been pretty complicated, and I don't want to reduce him to his disease, but it certainly showed in a quite spectacular way how intelligent he must have been. The speed or bandwidth at which he could communicate with even his computer was incredibly limited, which means that during his thoughts at a reasonable speed he was not even able to make any notes or sketches or diagrams or even just note down some essential parts of something. And while it's often said that this is supposedly unnecessary, and while I do think that there's some genuine talent or cleverness involved in being able to comprehend mathematical equations, I can still tell you, and so can probably anyone else who has ever had to do with slightly more complicated mathematics, that you still eventually kind of frustratingly run into that end where you have something so complex or big that, to simplify it, it's essentially too large for your short-term memory to properly handle and think about in an easy way. And so as much as I like the general idea that it's really about the mind and deep comprehension rather than just memory and such, it is still, in fact, pretty much impossible to even just comprehend higher level without even the ability to take notes or put your hand on something to mark where you are in an equation, let alone being able to actively contribute to the outer edge of theoretical physics. And again, while he did of course have a computer, his communication with that computer, his input method, was still too slow for that to be useful for most things. And in fact he had mentioned a few times that he has to think differently about things because he can't really write or sketch anything down. How he had to teach himself how to basically visually imagine things like four-dimensional space and comprehend it, because while he could note down mathematical definitions, it was often too slow and too impractical. And how this speculatively may have led to not all but some of his breakthroughs. And to me, just the very idea that there is such a human being who is capable of comprehending and contributing to theoretical physics in that way was on its own always incredibly impressive and inspiring. And of course that's by far not the only thing that was impressive about Stephen Hawking, and much less the only thing that was important about Stephen Hawking, but again many things have already been said, and I only wanted to do a really quick mention about one thing that I specifically found incredibly inspiring about Stephen Hawking that hasn't been mentioned everywhere before. And I'd say all that's left is to say goodbye, but there isn't really anything all that's left. I mean, this is a shocking tragedy either way, and nothing will just bring him back. Certainly not saying goodbye, but it's really all that we can do, say goodbye. And given that I couldn't find much about his cause of death, hope that maybe it wasn't too painful, as little as that means. Remember his work and carry on where he left.